Ethan Mars displays some symptoms that appear very unusual to the general public. For example, he has blackouts where he is apparently still doing things. He also has impossible experiences, such as the time he went to the train station and everyone froze in place. Does he have schizophrenia? I should start by noting that, in my opinion, the general public seems to really misunderstand schizophrenia. I've mostly heard it described as something where people believe they have multiple people living inside of them or that they have multiple personalities. This is actually a lot more closely related to dissociative identity disorder, which we'll talk about next time. Schizophrenia is much different than that. Allow me to explain. Schizophrenia is one of those disorders that is pretty complex, and it would take way too long for me to explain all the caveats of it in just this video. However, I'll do my best to provide a fairly brief and accurate explanation. To be diagnosed with schizophrenia, a person would need to have at least 2 of 5 possible criteria. Those 5 criteria are delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms. Let me explain what those mean since they are mostly in therapist lingo. A delusion is defined as a false belief based on incorrect inference about external reality that is firmly sustained despite what almost everyone else believes and despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. In other words, it's believing something that isn't true even though the person has proof that that thing isn't true. It's also not really consistent with what's common in that person's culture. For example, a person might believe in God and pray to God, and even be given proof that God doesn't exist. However, this wouldn't be considered a delusion in the United States because lots of people in the United States believe in God. Sometimes it's pretty hard to tell the difference between a delusion and a very firmly held belief, and professional judgment is often necessary. An example of a delusion might be believing that you own a piece of property even though you've been shown the deed to that property and you're not the one who owns it. Another example of a delusion might be believing that your neighbor is a cyborg and is trying to kill you. A hallucination is defined this way: a sensory perception that has the compelling sense of reality of a true perception, but that occurs without external stimulation of the relevant sensory organ. In other words, a person's brain believes that they're sensing something even though their organs, like their eyes or their ears, aren't actually picking up anything. Hallucinations involve the senses: sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. The most common hallucinations are hearing voices, and the second most common is seeing things. Since the person's mind believes that they're sensing something even though their organs aren't, to that person, the hallucination is very real, even though no one else is able to sense what's going on. An example of a hallucination might be hearing harassing voices. Another example might be seeing a bright light everywhere. Disorganized speech is kind of hard to explain. It's like when a person suddenly and constantly changes the subject, but it happens in an odd way. They will sometimes change the subject mid-sentence or even mid-word. Sometimes they'll string words together that are completely unrelated to each other, and that person's basically incomprehensible. That's what's known as word salad. An example of disorganized speech might be something like, I want star and bar, treetop, fire, gang, Washington, D.C., keep it up. Disorganized or catatonic behavior can take a variety of forms, but it basically boils down to behavior that doesn't seem to serve any purpose. Perhaps it could be engaging in repetitive movements, or saying something over and over again, or refusing to move for no apparent reason. An example of this could be someone who rubs their hands together all day, every day. Another example could be someone who just sits still and stares at nothing for hours at a time. Negative symptoms might not be what you'd expect, so allow me to explain. Typically, a person wakes up, goes to the bathroom, eats food, interacts with people, and they go about their daily business. Delusions and hallucinations are examples of something being added to this typical existence, and they are known as positive symptoms. Negative symptoms are when something is taken away from what is typical. Perhaps the person doesn't have an appetite. Perhaps they have no desire to interact with other people at all. Perhaps their overall thinking is less and they can't focus. Things like that. Other examples of negative symptoms might be a complete lack of motivation. Another example might be someone who expresses or feels little or no emotion. Well, that's an explanation of the five main parts of schizophrenia, and a person would need to have at least two of them to be considered for the diagnosis. A person only needs one if their delusion is bizarre. That means that there is absolutely no way that their belief is based in reality. There are actually other aspects of diagnosing schizophrenia, but I don't know that we really need to look at them because Ethan doesn't seem to meet any of those five criteria at all. The only one he even comes close with is the negative symptoms, where he's really depressed and has no motivation. But I think that has a lot more to do with PTSD related depression than it does with schizophrenia. Well, this has been a much longer video than usual. Stay tuned for our final episode on Ethan, where we will talk about whether or not he has multiple personality disorder.